Ready, please make sure your seat color is green. And at this time, I'd like to turn our presentation over to Ron.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you all for joining us today. Today I'm going to talk about SharePoint governance, successfully empowering users while keeping control. We're going to start with some quotes from Bill Gates in Information Management Challenges. The problem is twofold. We are suffering from information overload. We have an endless deluge of data that we have trouble keeping up. And the other problem is we don't have the tools to deal with all of these data, information underload, as he puts it. So can these challenges be addressed by governance? Well, let's talk about what is governance and conversely, what is chaos? And here we have a picture of some people on the trading floor all making lots of noise and having lots of chaos and no organization. And on the right, we have some U.S. soldiers standing at attention. So is chaos necessarily bad? Well, the gentlemen on the left are on the trading floor, and they're successful. They're making money. And is governance necessarily good? Well, the soldiers on the right are tightly ordered and very well organized, but in order to do anything, they need to receive orders. And so the turnaround time for action may not be as rapid. But on the downside of chaos, what is information technology chaos? Well, it's manifested as site proliferation. That is, sites with no ownership or responsibility, sites with no plan, and sites with a lot of junk in them. People will tend to create sites and just fill them up and then forget them. And they sit there in our IT system and really do nothing. Another form of information technology chaos is server proliferation. And this happens when IT doesn't respond quickly enough to end user needs. And so they tend to go around IT and just set up their own systems. This leads to a bunch of disparate, disconnected systems that really don't communicate well with each other. And finally, technology proliferation is a symptom of the bad side of chaos. And here we have a list of possible ways to store and access data. If the user is confronted with all these choices from desktop storage all the way down to document management systems, where does a user post a discussion or a document? And where and how does a user search for content and find the content they need? Some of the causes of information technology chaos are unreliable service or support, and a lack of training, and a lack of all the other things listed on this slide. Now, the good news is that SharePoint, with built-in functionality, addresses nearly everything on this list from lack of security audits on down. The governance plan will address these issues and help alleviate the problems when these problems arise. So what is governance? On this slide, I just collected a number of quotes from an internet search on what is governance. The first two bullets come from dictionary.com, and the last three bullets come from quotes that I got from specifically searching for governance under IT. And I want to point out some commonalities in all of these different definitions, and that is the appearance of the word management. Governance clearly has to do with management. And the other one thing I want to point out is that governance is used to define a service. In IT, what we're really doing is delivering an information technology service. And so the fourth bullet point, governance uses people, process, technology, and policies to define a service, resolve ambiguity, and mitigate conflict within an organization. And that's a great definition of governance in terms of SharePoint governance. And that's further refined in the last bullet point to talk about policies, process, and ensure overall long-term success of your SharePoint environment. Now, SharePoint governance is a big subject, and it may seem intimidating, but it is not overly difficult. A lot of governance is common knowledge and common sense, and the real challenge to people who are addressing building a governance plan is that there are a lot of details to consider. The decisions themselves are probably not all that hard, but there are a huge number of details that need to be covered to have a successful governance plan. And the last point I want to make on this slide is that governance plans are neither predetermined nor static. And by that I mean you do not need to have a complete and totally inclusive governance plan in place before you start your SharePoint implementation. And once you have a governance plan in place, it should not be static. It should not be something you write once and set on the shelf and then ignore. The components of successful governance really include two things: a governance plan and a governance board, or what we like to call a center of excellence. And really it all comes down to these two things: a good plan and good people to execute and maintain it. The governance board members should consist of representatives of the 5 sections we have on this slide. I'd like to focus mainly on the executive sponsors and the end user representatives. Remember that we're building a service, and so it is all about the end users. And so if the end users are not satisfied with the SharePoint deployment, you're going to get poor adoption and people will not be using your SharePoint system. The executive sponsorship is very important because the executives will provide the guidance, will be the final arbiter of decisions, and really help keep people on track. Business stakeholders, IT representatives, and legal representatives are also all important. It's the IT reps who will probably end up being tasked with carrying out the procedures and policies that the governance board decides. And the legal and business stakeholders will need to be there to make sure that your IT service actually is helping out the organization. But to my opinion, the most important is the executive sponsors and the end user representatives. So the governance board responsibilities, here's a long list of what they're responsible for, but really it all boils down to the last bullet point. They must deliver an information technology service. And so as we go through this list, we can see all these things will combine to get to that last bullet point. They must be the final arbiter of decisions. They must prioritize. They must ensure that the content is consistent and available, address needs, and determine delegation of authority and maintenance of the governance plan. That maps back to the idea that the governance plan is not a static document. It's something that evolves with the business. As the business grows and changes, the governance plan should grow and change with it. So the components of a successful governance plan include vision, goals, mission statement, and defined metrics. The vision really is, what are we trying to do here? Are we trying to empower our teams, empower our end users? Are we trying to drive efficiency? The goals are a lot like vision, but they're a little more specific. Our goals might be to reduce the total cost of ownership of our deployment. It might be to provide service and a solution. Our goals may include reducing redundant technology and removing legacy. And a very important goal that should be included is get user adoption. We want to get our users to use our SharePoint deployment. And all of these things should be put in a mission statement. This should be a real document that lives somewhere in your organization so you can keep track of where you are. And finally, defined metrics are very important. You must be able to answer the question, how are we doing? How is our governance plan doing? How's our deployment plan doing? Is it servicing the needs of our organization? And the defined metrics can have very hard statistics in it, like site usage and things like that. So getting back to our chaos versus governance question, what we really want to do is to strike a balance and get user adoption, and that is strike a balance between IT control and end user empowerment. And there's a real trade-off here. If IT is exerting strict control over your SharePoint deployment, then they know at all times everything in the deployment, and they can respond to any problem that may arise. However, the turnaround time for the end users to get service may be so long that the end users decide, well, this is too much trouble, I'm not going to use it. On the flip side, if we grant our end users full control over the SharePoint environment without any governance policies to cover that, then we get what we call the wild, wild west. And yes, the end user's turnaround time goes to 0. They get what they want as quickly as they can click the mouse, but the net result could be a lot of chaos. And a perfect example is in the provisioning of sites. Say, for example, you have two types of end users who want exactly the same type of site. Well, if it's full self-service, the end users can go off and spin two sites that do exactly the same thing. So if there's a little governance control, we can try and alleviate some of this potential redundancy. Now, Neudesic has identified the areas of successful SharePoint governance plan, and they include provisioning, process, system, and development. Now, if one goes online and searches out other white papers and discussions on governance, you'll find various collections of categories about what makes up a successful SharePoint governance plan. What we have found is it can all be rolled really into these 4 areas. And if you are covering these 4 areas, then your governance plan is going to be rather complete and very successful. So to talk about provisioning, I'd like to remind the audience that SharePoint really is a hierarchical set of containers, starting at the farm at the top, going through the web application, which maps to content databases, then to the site collection level, down to the site level, the list library level, and finally the list item level. The list item is the smallest unit of information that can be provisioned in a SharePoint deployment. And really the provisioning part of the governance plan should address every level of this container hierarchy. So starting at the top, the SharePoint web application is a collection of site collections, and the decision to create a SharePoint web application should definitely be made by the governance board, and authority for that type of operation should not be delegated. The web application should be provisioned only by the farm administrators. So what we're saying is in the balance between tight governance and end user control, at the web application level, it should definitely go all the way over to tight governance by IT. One of the decisions that needs to be made when you're creating a web application is whether or not additional content databases should be used. By default, each SharePoint web application uses a single content database. However, you can have multiple content databases that are determined at the site collection level within a web application. Another consideration has to do with the use of MySites. If your organization chooses to deploy MySites to its end users, you need to make the decision, should the MySites be deployed as an additional web application, or should the MySites be deployed as part of the web application within your corporate intranet? Now, the trade-offs here are many-fold. For example, if the MySites are part of the corporate intranet web application and they're sharing the same content database, then whatever backup and restore and disaster recovery plan that's in place for your content database applies to the MySites as well as the internal corporate content. However, if MySites are split off as their own web application with their own content database, then there can be a separate service level agreement for the backup and restore. And since there is effort and cost behind doing this type of maintenance for the content databases, it may be a good idea to do that. Let's remember that not all information has the same value. Some information may be totally mission critical to your organization, and some information may not be so important. And so do you want to invest a lot of resources to maintain information that's not so important? Or the worst case, do you want to not invest enough resources into maintaining your mission critical information? So at the web application and content database, one can make a decision based on all these considerations. Now, at the site collection level, that's the first real point where the governance board has to make a choice about whether they're going to delegate any of the authority to provision SharePoint containers. SharePoint has a self-service site creation feature that will allow end users to create their own site collections without administrator permissions. Now, this is a great idea from an end user point of view because they get rapid turnaround on getting new site collections. However, it can lead to some of this chaos we were talking about earlier. So there's a couple of best practices we recommend that if self-service site creation is enabled, then strict control over the usage and size should be employed. That is, if these site collections aren't being used at all, they should be retired and archived. And the amount of disk space given or the quota given to these site collections should be strictly controlled. Now, some of the concerns over site collection overproliferation can be reduced through the use of Neudesic's Site Provisioning Wizard. This tool helps end users make good decisions about how or even if a new site collection is to be created. And it provides an interface for end users to create sites that are properly categorized and provisioned based on corporate policy. Any chaos or confusion that may occur as a result of having access to dozens or even hundreds of site collections can further be reduced through the use of Neudesic's SharePoint launch bar, which is kind of like a navigation tool patterned after the Groove launch bar. So consider a situation where you're an end user and you have access to dozens, if not hundreds, of site collections. Well, that can be kind of confusing, and with these tools, we can help alleviate some of that confusion. Now, on the other side, the other extreme must also be avoided, and that is you shouldn't restrict your number of site collections to a value too small. The site collection in SharePoint is a natural border for much of the functionality built into SharePoint. That is, security groups, web part galleries, and even the navigation that's built in is all bordered at the site collection level. And so many organizations, in order to take advantage of this functionality, try to stuff as much of their content into a single site collection. And this can lead to problems as well. So it's best to remember that site collections provide both a logical and physical separation of content within a SharePoint environment. If you see that your information falls into specific silos or categories, perhaps it really requires its own site collection. Now, at the lower levels, the subsites, lists, and libraries, we see the same decisions and considerations for whether you're going to delegate authority for the provisioning of SharePoint containers. However, within a single site collection, it's much easier to delegate more authority to the end users because even if they do over-provision and create too many sites and create some chaos, at least all of that chaos is confined within a single site collection. So it's easier for the governance board to allow end users more control at this level. Now, the ability to create list items is really the heart of SharePoint collaboration, and it should definitely be granted to most, if not all, of your users. If your users cannot add and edit to your list items, they really aren't taking advantage of the full collaboration functionality within SharePoint. However, what needs to be also taken into account is the management of list settings. The normal member or user of a SharePoint list or library is granted contribute permissions, meaning that he or she can add or edit content in a list, but they can't change the list settings. They can't, for example, add a new column to the list or change a column or change the approval workflow settings. This is probably a good idea because you do want to exert some governance control over these things. For example, you don't want your end users shutting down approval without letting anyone know. But at the same time, when end users do need a change, for example, they do need a new list or they do need a current list to have a new column, there's going to be some turnaround time while the people who do have permissions can go ahead and make these changes. The last point I want to make on this slide is that the Pages library within publishing sites may present a very special case about the management of the list settings and the ability to contribute content. If your users have contribute permissions at a site, that means they can contribute to any list or library in that site, and that includes the Pages library within a publishing site. So consider a situation where you have a publishing site provisioned and there is general corporate content in that web content section of the pages library that you don't want your end users editing, but you do want your end users to have the power to edit documents in other document libraries. Well, in this case, it may be a good idea for you to consider breaking off the pages library with some type of unique or separate permissions settings so that you can control tighter governance on the web content being displayed to all your users, and then have more user control on the other document libraries where the collaboration is going on. The last point I want to make about provisioning and the provisioning part of the governance plan is that there are other non-content resources that need to be part of your provisioning plan. That is, we talked about the SharePoint containers, the site collections and the sites and the lists and the libraries, but this slide shows some of the non-content resources that also need to be part of the SharePoint governance plan, and that includes audiences, Excel services, InfoPath services, business data catalog services. Now, many of these things are very advanced and perhaps not suitable for the initial rollout of your SharePoint governance plan. However, as your organization grows and evolves and starts to take advantage of these more advanced MOS features, the governance plan needs to keep up and continue to have its rules and policies regarding provisioning of these resources. Moving on to process governance, I'd like to point out that this slide deck contains only one slide on process governance. But what I don't want you to come away with is the idea that process governance is less important or requires less attention from the governance board. In fact, the process governance probably will require the most amount of are required in a governance plan, and how broad and deep SharePoint is. Much of that, if not most of that, falls under process governance. Process governance defines the procedures for SharePoint operations and basically answers the question, how do I? And this how do I question covers everything from the mundane, like how do I upload a document, to the complex, like how do I create and deploy an interface between SharePoint and a pre-existing line of business application. So these types of processes all need to be considered in part of the process governance section of your plan. This needs to include things like naming conventions for column values. People who are using SharePoint document libraries, for example, know that the title field is not required for documents loaded into a document library. Is this a good idea? Well, it may or may not be a good idea within your organization. Perhaps your process governance that covers how do I upload a document includes rules about including a title field value for your documents and defining the naming conventions for that title field. Other things process governance is going to cover are the types of files and content that are stored in SharePoint and requests for new functionality. Now, not everything belongs in SharePoint, and one can find several articles on the web that talk about this. And an example I'd like to give is an exe file. If you wish to distribute an executable file to all the users within your organization, it is probably not a good idea to do it by posting it as an item in a SharePoint document library. And in fact, by default, the exe extension is not allowed in SharePoint. Requests for new functionality will include new custom code, will include new SharePoint objects, getting back to an end user requesting a new list or requesting a column added to an existing list. That all should be handled under the process governance. System governance, similarly, seems simple, but the devil's in the details. People who are putting together the system governance part of the overall governance plan need to concern themselves with authentication and authorization. That is, they need to focus on how users are provided access to the SharePoint system and how management of these users is accomplished. And this really means permissions in SharePoint groups. One of the best practices we like to recommend is that individual users should not be added to SharePoint groups if at all possible. If your organization is authenticating against Active Directory groups, the membership of SharePoint groups should be managed through Active Directory groups. This kind of gives you what we call one-stop shopping for adding and removing members of your organization. If you do it all through AD, when you add a new employee or an employee leaves, you just do it once in the AD. And because the AD groups are assigned to SharePoint groups, SharePoint immediately understands that change. The other things that are covered under system governance is the monitoring of the SharePoint installation. This includes not only the performance, but what are the usage statistics? And this can actually map back to that metrics we talked about earlier in the components of a governance plan. Which people are using which sites? What is the overall load? For example, are your search crawls taking place at a time of high load, and should that perhaps be rescheduled to a different time of day? The system governance will also cover the scheduled maintenance. This includes the deployment of upgrades and service packs. And last but certainly not least, system governance part of the governance plan needs to cover the backup and restore and disaster recovery scenarios. I'd like to reiterate that not all information is of equal value, and in addition to that, not all information changes at the same speed. By that I mean your SharePoint deployment will end up having content that is very dynamic, content that's changing all the time and adding and being edited, but it will also have content that doesn't change very often. For example, an FAQ list is something that really won't change very often, or the overall corporate mission statement is probably something that doesn't change all that often. And so perhaps we should employ differential backup and restore and disaster recovery strategies to cover these types of information. Again, remember, multiple content databases within a given web application will allow for these different schedules of backup operations. Last point I'd like to talk about is development and deployment of customizations. And what are some of the best practices and what needs to be in your governance plan for development and deployment of custom functionality? Now remember, how your custom functionality is requested is covered under process. But once it has been decided there's going to be some customization built and deployed, then this section of the governance plan will talk about how that can be done. So to start off with, the patterns and practices for traditional software development should also be applied to SharePoint development. And the governance plan should include details such as naming conventions. And at this point, I not only mean naming conventions in terms of things like how to name a list or how to name a column, but I also mean in the SharePoint code, in that code you're writing, that custom code, there should be naming conventions for how to name variables and such things like that. So if new developers come on board and your developers turn over, they don't have a long ramp-up time to get up to speed on the code you created and deployed. Development and testing should occur in multiple steps on multiple environments, and overall, and I bolded this to make sure everyone got the message, any and all development that results in the production of custom code should be created and deployed as a SharePoint solution package file. For those of you who are not familiar with the WSP file, it is definitely the way to deploy your code. If you have a SharePoint deployment that consists of multiple servers in your farm, for example, multiple front-end web servers, multiple application servers, index servers, and all these things, and you hope to deploy a new assembly that's compiled into a DLL, you don't want to have to touch every server manually to do these steps. It would become a deployment nightmare scenario. Similarly, the deployment of things like web parts often require modification of the IIS server web.config file. And again, this is something you do not want to have to do manually multiple times for every server in your farm. Fortunately, we have the SharePoint solution package file, which does all this for us behind the scenes. You can deploy anything in a WSP, site definitions, new .NET code, web parts, anything and everything can be deployed as a WSP file. Your SharePoint administrators can add this WSP file to a solution store within central administration and then basically do one-click deployment. And behind the scenes, SharePoint takes care of everything on every server in your farm. The other great advantage of the WSP file is it can also be backed out of your farm with very simple operation. That is, removed from your farm. So everything and anything should be deployed as a WSP. Getting back to the point of using multiple environments, one of the things that you definitely wish to avoid is doing development on your production environments. Definitely do development on multiple non-production environments to try things out, make sure they work, and then finally deploy it to production when you are sure it's rock solid and ready to go. This slide shows a recommended development scenario where we have individual developers on the left, each with their own virtual SharePoint environment, who are creating their code, and they are creating things and putting them on what's called a development server. The development server then takes all these pieces from our developers and integrates them into the WSP package. That WSP package is then deployed to what's called an integration server, and the purpose of the integration server is to make sure that this new customization is going to be compatible with your existing SharePoint deployment. So whereas development server is really used to bring the pieces of code together and put them all into one package, it's the integration server whose responsibility is to make sure that it's going to work and play well with what is on production. Now by that I mean the integration server should more closely resemble your production server in terms of the content that is on it. Development servers don't necessarily need to show the same content that's in production, but once you get to integration, and certainly in QA, these environments should mimic what is on production, both in terms of the structure and the content. Now, I want to make one final comment about the QA server. It's not really necessary for your overall development environment. However, what a QA server does get you is that if you have a QA server, you may start a new software development cycle while a current software development cycle is in QA. That is, if development cycle A makes it to QA, you can start development cycle B before A is deployed to production. All these environments, of course, could require lots and lots of hardware, but virtualization will help out a lot in this case. Virtualized environments can be used for all but your production environment, and it's recommended they be used for all but your production environment. The developer tools should be the latest releases of Microsoft Visual Studio and Microsoft Office SharePoint Designer, but your governance plan should also allow for use of some of these other tools that are out there, specifically the Visual Studio extensions for Windows SharePoint services. WSP Builder and STS Dev are extremely effective tools for creating these solution packages, and they should be allowed by your governance plan. The request to get any other type of development tool should go through some type of vetting process by the governance board review. So in summary, Neudesic identifies 4 areas that make up a successful governance plan. And this governance plan is something that's neither created and left untouched, nor is it something that must be completed before SharePoint is rolled out. A governance board or center of excellence is an essential part of our successful SharePoint deployment, and a properly implemented SharePoint environment will provide a unified, enterprise-ready solution that boosts organizational effectiveness and efficiency. A successful governance plan driven by the center of excellence will lead to a proper implementation. And I thank you for your time and attention, and I'm going to turn this now back over to Katie for questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Ron. This was a wonderful presentation. We did have a few questions come through. So we'll go ahead and read the first question. How do we get started on creating a governance plan?
Well, opinion is that the first thing you should do is create your governance board. And from the governance board, they can create the governance plan. And you start in your governance plan by asking, what are the operations that our end users are using today? And what are some of the pain points for our end users? For example, pain points in uploading documents or pain points in collaborating on a document. And then say, how can this be addressed by enforcing some policies and procedures? So start off with the board and then analyze what your end users are doing today and what their pain points are.
Great. Next question, how do we know if our SharePoint implementation is too chaotic, too rigid, or just right?
Well, you know it's just right if you're getting user adoption. If people are using it and are moving away from file shares and making use of all this functionality, you know it's just right. How do you know if it's too chaotic? Well, it's too chaotic if people are having difficulty finding resources. And if you see a lot of complaints like, I don't know how to do something because I can't find it, or which of these sites should I be using to perform this operation, that is a suggestion that you are in a state of too great a chaos. In terms of the other extreme, how do you know when things are too rigid? Well, this is if you don't get user adoption because people find the SharePoint implementation too difficult to use. If it takes them 2 weeks to get a list created, they may just say, forget it, I'm going to do this elsewhere. So you know you're too rigid if you're getting complaints because turnaround time is too slow, and you know you're too chaotic if you're getting complaints and lack of adoption because people can't find things and don't know how to do operations.
Great, and we have one last question that came through. How do we enforce the policies in the process part of the governance plan?
Well, that's a great one. So you do need, at a certain level, you do need some cooperation from your end users. Policies and procedures are all wonderful, but you do need to have, at some ultimate level, some cooperation from your end users, and this is achieved through training. An important piece of any SharePoint implementation is that there be extensive training and access to extensive training resources so people know how to follow the rules. On the other side, there are some things one can do to enforce some governance policies, and I'm going to go back to that example of the title field in the document library. By default, that title field is not required, but if your organization's governance plan dictates that every document must have a title, then simply make that field required. So there are a number of things one can do to enforce the rules, such as making fields required, establishing quotas, and operations like that. So between that and making sure your users are well trained, you should cover how your governance plan is enforced.
Great. Now at this time, if anyone has any further questions, please feel free to type them in. In the meantime, I'm going to click through a few of our polling questions, and we would greatly appreciate your feedback. Go to our first question. Was this content helpful for your business? Please go ahead and answer. Thank you, everyone who's participating. It looks like this presentation was very helpful. Next question. Please rate the presentation content. Excellent, good, poor. Great. Again, thank you all for participating. And the third question, would you like us to schedule a follow-up? Give everyone one more second. Okay. Now, it doesn't seem that there is any further questions, so we would like to thank Ron for this great presentation this afternoon. We will be forwarding out the recorded version of the presentation when it becomes available in about a week's time. If you have any further questions about this presentation or Neudesic in general, please feel free to email myself or Ron at the email addresses provided on this ending slide. Again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on our next webcast. We're now all free to disconnect.